Reuters has a piece by Luke Cohen entitled Analysis Behind Yachts and Planes, U.S. Turns to Foreign Agent Laws to Curb Russian Influence. In the 5 months since the U.S. Department of Justice launched a task force to seize Russian oligarchs' assets to pressure Moscow over its invasion of Ukraine, prosecutors have targeted something less tangible: Russia's influence. This, in the context of on July 29th of this year, the FBI raided the Uhuru House in St. Petersburg, Florida, and the Uhuru Solidarity Center in St. Louis, Missouri. The raids are connected with the indictment of a Russian national who was accused of attempting to, quote, cause turmoil in the United States, end quote, by engaging with, quote, unindicted co-conspirators, end quote, to act as agents of the Russian Federation. What is the government really targeting here? Influence or a different narrative based in fact? For insight, let's turn to our next guest. He holds the John J. and Rebecca Moore's Chair of History and African American Studies at the University of Houston. He's one of the most prolific writers of our time. His latest book is entitled The Counter-Revolution of 1836, Texas Slavery, Jim Crow, and the Roots of American Fascism. Dr. Gerald Horne, as always, sir, welcome back to Inside the Issues.
Thank you for inviting me.
So there's a lot of historical precedents here to what the government is engaged in here. We've got the COINTELPRO program. We've got a number of these types of activities. Why should people in the African American community be outraged at this latest action by the so-called Department of Justice?
Well, I think that the African American community should be foremost in being outraged about what's happening in St. Louis and St. Petersburg, Florida, because what that raid did, which involved the use of drones, the use of flash grenades, the use of handcuffs, even though none of those who were treated thusly were charged with any crimes, it's obviously a signal that a certain kind of dissent will not be tolerated. And I'm afraid to say that this particular outrage was not unprecedented. I think immediately of what happened to W.E.B. Du Bois, a founder of the NAACP, a founder of Pan-Africanism, what happened to him in his 83rd year, approximately 70 odd years ago in the early 1950s, when he was handcuffed, when he was put on trial in federal court for supposedly being the agent of a foreign power, unnamed foreign power, of course, ostensibly the foreign power was Moscow, not unlike what's happening today. And that was because he advocated banning and outlawing nuclear weapons. And so the thesis was Moscow was in favor of banning nuclear weapons. Du Bois is in favor of banning nuclear weapons. Ipso facto, Du Bois is an agent of Moscow. Now, he was able to escape jail time, not least because of a mass movement, but certainly a signal was sent to the Black community because you only have to beat one slave to keep the entire plantation in line. And the signal was, keep your distance from international affairs in particular. And this was a particularly ominous signal to send to Black Americans because historically, the way we were able to escape from the ravages of slavery in particular was because of international alliances. Our alliance with the Haitian Revolution, 1791 to 1804, a successful uprising of the enslaved in the Caribbean, our alliance with British abolitionists, the great Black American abolitionist Frederick Douglass was spending more time in London in the 1840s than Paul Robeson did spend in Moscow in the 20th century, even though London was oftentimes at sword's point with Washington. They had fought a war, you may recall, between 1812 and 1814. And we already know that because of Black American solidarity with London, that was seen as a mortal threat to US national security. Recall what happened in August 1814 when redcoats sacked and torched Washington, D.C., assisted by enslaved Africans who then escaped on British boats to Trinidad and Tobago, where their descendants continue to reside. What this reflects is the structural problem in the United States of America, going back to slavery, where it was intended that we would be slaves forevermore, but we were able to turn the tables by forging these global alliances and forcing our antagonists to retreat. In the middle of the 20th century, leaders like Du Bois and Robeson forged alliances globally too. They paid a stiff and heavy price. As noted, Du Bois barely escaped prison. And so today, in 2022, those who try to walk in the footsteps of Du Bois and Robeson are treated rather harshly. But what this does is restrict ideological space, because what it says is that we have to stick to the four corners of the United States of America, even though our antagonists are not so bound. I'm sure you know the story of Viktor Orban, the right-wing populist leader of Hungary, who spoke in Texas just this week and was beating the drum, the racist drum. And Mike Pence and Tucker Carlson and other right-wingers make pilgrimages regularly to Budapest, Hungary. And so the message is the right wing, our antagonists, can be internationalists. They can gain solidarity abroad. We are not allowed that kind of solidarity. We cannot stand for that.
What about what I see as an incredible double standard or hypocrisy in that they're incredibly concerned about quote unquote Russian influence, but AIPAC seems to be able to just run amok, and AIPAC can invest all kinds of millions of dollars into domestic political campaigns, whether it be to challenge congressional races in Michigan or in Ohio, or as they once did in Georgia. And they're bringing in outside money to directly influence elections. You've got the Urban Empowerment Action Pact that's championed by Bakari Sellers, for example. And there's no problem there, but let it be perceived that there is any kind of alliance, any kind of collaboration with Russian interests, and all of a sudden all bets are off.
Well, it's actually worse than that, because all it takes is some sort of alleged confluence between what a Black American says and what Moscow says. For example, Du Bois is against nuclear weapons, Moscow's against nuclear weapons, therefore Du Bois is an agent of Moscow. It can reach the level of the absurd, and let me take it there just to show you what I mean. Moscow's hypothetically is against tooth decay, you're against tooth decay, ipso facto, you're an agent of Moscow. But what's even more troubling about the Israeli lobby interference, as the New York Times pointed out in an article a few weeks ago, they seem to have a particular proclivity for attacking Black women on the left. I'm thinking of Donna Edwards in Prince George's County, Maryland. I'm thinking
Correct.
of Nina Turner
in Ohio.
And what's so outrageous about AIPAC that they have just dislodged a Jewish American progressive congressman, speaking of Andy Levin of Michigan, who also happened to be the leader of his synagogue. And so they're able to run amok in US politics, but do not have a Black American even think about having some sort of alliance with some sort of foreign power. And of course, we're immediately pulverized and penalized. This is something that is outrageous, clearly, and is something that we should not stand for.
To the point of we should not stand for, well, the organizations that we historically turn to for support and for articulation of our interests seem to be conspicuously silent.
I'm afraid to say that you are correct, and this is nothing new. As noted, when Du Bois was prosecuted, the NAACP did not rush to his defense, even though he was not only their founder, but also the fact that what happened to him would redound to the detriment of the NAACP itself. The NAACP actually collaborated against the late, great Paul Robeson. You had NAACP leaders who raked Martin Luther King across the coals after he decided to come out foursquare against the war in Vietnam. And I'm also troubled, I'm afraid to say, by some of the actions of Congressional Black Caucus members. I'm thinking of Congressman Gregory Meeks of Southeast Queens, New York, in particular, chairman of the House Foreign Affairs Committee, who happened to accompany Speaker Nancy Pelosi on that disastrous, dangerous, perilous journey she made to Taiwan, which had the potential to lead to World War III. In fact, still might do so.
Mm-hmm.
He should not have been on that plane, but instead, he was acting like a mime, mimicking every word and maneuver that Nancy Pelosi said or made. I don't know if you saw the footage when they landed at the airport in Taiwan. Nancy Pelosi would take a step forward, he would take a step forward. She would turn and wave, he would turn and wave. I don't know if he was concerned about being mistaken for her security, or somebody thought it might be weird for a Black person in a suit and tie to be on the tarmac in Taiwan. But in any case, it was not his finest hour. He should have been back in Washington campaigning and clamoring against Nancy Pelosi's outrageous visit. But I guess he knows what side of the bread is buttered on. And so he decided that the better part of wisdom was to accompany her and have the prospect of World War III be down.
He did the same, as you said earlier, Marcel Marceau impression in Ukraine as well.
Not only that, but as you know, he's carried legislation that would penalize and pulverize African nations who refuse to go along with the sanctions regime against Moscow in light of Ukraine. And what's interesting is that there are blocks that are developing. That is to say, on the one hand, you have the NATO bloc, the North Atlantic Treaty Organization, led by the United States of America. We know that in the bad old days of apartheid, in the bad old days of Portuguese colonialism in Angola and Mozambique and Guinea-Bissau, the United States stood by its NATO allies. Speaking of Portugal, we know that when NATO exceeded a United Nations mandate to dislodge the Gaddafi regime in Libya, which, by the way, had established rather fruitful relations with Black Americans, including myself, by the way, if you're interested. And yet, the African Union reprimanded NATO for exceeding that United Nations mandate, begged NATO not to engage in regime change, which of course they proceeded to do. And since that time, Libya has been racked with chaos. In fact, there are credible stories about enslavement of darker skinned Africans being taking place in Libya. We already see the horrific pictures of refugees, that is to say, Africans from Libya and due south are trying to cross the Mediterranean into Italy and drowning in the waters. Or you might have seen the video just a few days ago that took place in US allies, speaking of Italy, where a Nigerian man was beaten on camera. It was like a Rodney King incident, Rodney King or George Floyd incident, only worse, insofar as people were watching idly as this Black person was being pummeled to death. You have a neo-fascist party about to come to power in Rome within the next few weeks. If the Black American leadership thinks that these global currents will pass us by, I think that they're sadly mistaken. And in fact, if they think that, I would like to smoke what they've been smoking.
Well, you mentioned organizations, you mentioned leadership. Well, you've got, for example, Karen Bass on the board of directors of the National Endowment for Democracy, which we know is just a CIA front organization that they use to foment coups in foreign countries. You've got, again, I mentioned the urban the Urban Empowerment Action PAC, Bakari Sellers has become carrying their water, going into the African-American community under the cloak of urban empowerment. And all he's really doing is bringing in championing Zionist interests in the Black community. And we know that Zionism is racism. You've got Team Blue. Hakeem Jeffries is the leader of Team Blue, and his assignment is to protect the seats of moderate Democrats who are being challenged by progressive Democrats. And then you've also already mentioned Gregory Meeks. Man, that's a sad list of folks that are in positions to be championing and advocating our interests, and unfortunately, they're agent provocateurs, or pick a term.
Well, as noted, as suggested, the mortal fear of those who rule this country is that the 40+ million Black American community will align with the real or imagined antagonists of the United States of America. This goes back to the era of slavery, as noted, when oftentimes we found ourselves in league with British abolitionists or with Haitian revolutionaries. But it also continues in the 21st century. I do not find it accidental that before Barack Obama, the man most oftentimes mentioned as a presidential nominee of African descent was, of course, Colin Powell, who had been a soldier who had fought in Vietnam, who had been chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, and of course became the Secretary of State, putting him in that front position, so to speak, in order to deal with that international community. It's routine now to put Black Americans at the United Nations, such as the present Linda Greenfield,
right,
who is the UN ambassador, Susan Rice before her. Also, an adjunct of that particular trend is picking Black American police officers who have shown that they're willing to crack the heads of fellow Black people into City Hall. It's no accident that the first Black mayor of Los Angeles was a former police officer, speaking of Tom Bradley, who served for 2 decades, soon to be replaced, we believe, by the aforementioned Karen Bass, or that the second Black mayor of New York City, serving today, Eric Adams, a former police officer as well. So the only thing that should be shocking or surprising about what I'm saying is that these obvious trends have not been discernible to many. And when that happens, oftentimes disaster is lurking right around the corner.
In terms of we have just about 4 minutes left. In terms of the broader implications of this FBI raid on the Uhuru Solidarity Center beyond the African-American community, what does this say to you about the bigger picture as the United States does everything in its power to squash dissent, to remove people from social media that are bringing up challenging narratives to the lies that are being told here? What does this say to you about the broader landscape?
Well, the broader landscape is this. As suggested a moment or two ago, African nations are by and large hostile to NATO. That's why so many of them abstained in United Nations votes in the last few months seeking to sanction Russia. As a result, you see African nations cuddling ever closer to the alternative bloc led by China, now in conflict with US forces in the South China Sea and with ostensible US ally Taiwan, which China claims is rebel province. You see that as well with regard to Iran. That is to say that Washington realizes that it has its hands full, not only confronting 2 nuclear powers, speaking of Moscow and Beijing, but on the side, confronting angrily Iran, the Islamic Republic. That was the import of Mr. Biden's journey to Israel and Saudi Arabia just a few weeks ago. And so you saw what happened just this week where the United States sought to reopen nuclear talks with Iran in Vienna, Austria. Robert Malley, their negotiator, is on his way to Vienna, Austria as we speak, because I think Washington realizes that it's perhaps bitten off more than it can chew. But I guess Washington feels as long as you have a somnolent Black leadership and Black organizational structure that is by and large unwilling to engage in solidarity with Africa, by and large unwilling to speak out forcefully in dissent with regard to some of these insane and inane foreign policies, these harebrained schemes such as confronting China in the South China Sea, despite the fact that the Pentagon has done 19 tabletop exercises or war games involving a US confrontation with China. And guess what? The United States lost every time. So this is something that is not only dangerous, it's provocative. And this is why we need leadership at this fraught moment. And I'm like the man seeking an honest man. I'm just seeking some forthright leadership.
About 2 minutes, getting back to Nancy Pelosi and her foolishness in Taiwan. She goes from Taiwan to South Korea, and South Korean President Yoon Suk Yeol is on a staycation. He won't even come out of his house to see her. What signal does that send?
Well, I think that it sends an appropriate signal, because as I understand it, the current war games that are about to unfold between the United States and South Korea will also involve some sort of presumed or planned attack on the person of Chairman Kim, the leader of the Democratic People's Republic of Korea. And as you know, the United States has gotten into hot water in the 20th century by underestimating North Korea. And in fact, that implicates China, because recall that after the United States intervention in the Korean Peninsula in June 1950, there was this self-satisfaction because there was felt that China would not cross the border and to confront the United States and their United Nations allies. Of course, that proved to be false. You had a number of US nationals who were killed. Apparently, that lesson has been forgotten. And so I'm afraid to say history, unfortunately, may tragically repeat itself.
Dr. Gerald Horne, as always, sir, thank you so much for your time. Stay with me, please.